Okay, good morning. It's good morning in Boston, or good evening if it's in Houston, Texas. So today we're going to do a little bit of background on Juneteenth, which was the day of liberation for slaves in Texas. But before I do that, because I'll forget, I just want to recommend a number of books. I could recommend a shelf full of books, and I'll come back and I'll finish with these books as well. That don't be put off by the size of this. Anything by Eric Foner, and he's still alive and well. Anything by Eric Foner is excellent on Reconstruction and post-war South, post-war Texas. This happens to be Reconstruction, America's unfinished revolution, 1863 to 1877. This is just for you, because I like you guys. This is called the State of Jones. And the State of Jones seceded, imagine that, seceded from Mississippi after Mississippi had seceded from the Union. State of Jones, deals with wartime, the State of Jones, which you've never heard of, I know. If you have not read by Tom Wheeler, Mr. Lincoln's T-mails, he was a very electronic president. He would be very happy today, using email or messaging or whatever. I'm almost done. And this is going to lead me to the 13th Amendment. This is called Worse Than Slavery, and it deals with the post-Civil War era, dealing with the condition of black men and black women. And I'm going to leave this out so I remember to do it. I sound like Julia Childs, don't I? So I'm going to put this over here and reserve it. I'm not going to drop anything. Hey, do you remember seeing the Julia Childs episode where she dropped, it was either a fish, remember that? It was either a fish or a piece of chicken. And she said, don't worry, we'll still use it. And she just laughed. Great sense of humor. Worse than slavery. And this deals with the situation, after the 13th Amendment. And I might as well do this now because it's still on the books. I don't think it'll be still on the books in another 3 or 4 years. But let me share this with you. There were 3 Civil War amendments, 13, 14, and 15. The 13th, January 1st, and I'll get back to that, in 1863, abolished slavery, at least in those states that were still out of the Union. The 14th Amendment made Indians and black men and women citizens. And the 15th Amendment gave folks, black men, the right to vote. And that's a whole, different story, Rose, for a different day. But what I want to share with you, and this is still on the books, and I think it'll be removed, sooner than later, given the situation. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except for a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been convicted, shall exist within the United States or in any place subject to their jurisdiction. Now, that phrase in the 13th Amendment deals with slavery, black prisoners who have been convicted, and are in prison, that people can come and hire them out and to work the fields or to harvest or sow the fields. And, just for the record, during those raging fires in California over the summer, that folks who wanted to serve under that phrase, people who are in prison, can go out into the fields and fight the forest fire. That is still on the books. And I'll bet you, whatever you've got in your pocket, and I've got a little bit in my pocket, not as much as you do, can volunteer to clear fire, to build roads and bridges and so forth. And it is a little bit of a wrinkle in slavery, involuntary servitude. And I'll bet you're going to see that phrase removed from the 13th Amendment sooner than later. Now, June 13th, 13th, like
19th.
19th, yeah, June 19th. June 19th. Why am I saying June 13th? It's not my birthday. It's one of my son's birthdays. June 19th is when the word came to Texas that the Emancipation Proclamation had been passed by Lincoln by an executive order January 1st, 1863. So we need to frame our discussion around the Emancipation Proclamation. I have a habit of doing that. If you've been with me for some time, you'll see how I try to frame it. We need to frame the Emancipation Proclamation in this way to give it some context. The Emancipation Proclamation was issued by Lincoln by an executive order. By an executive order signed by Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, one of the few times that he used his first name, his whole name. He did not like the first name Abraham for whatever reason. Maybe it was too religious for him, but he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which was an executive order. He signed it in September, but it did not take effect until January. And Lincoln was getting pressure in 1862 by the abolitionists, and for the fact that Great Britain and France had abolished slavery in their empires, and he was getting pressure from the North and the abolitionist press to use the war to abolish slavery. Now, Lincoln saw the war initially as a way to put down secession and to bring the Union back together. But as I said, that he was getting pressure from all quarters and from Congress. Congress in 1862, I've forgotten the date, but Congress in 1862 had abolished slavery within the District of Columbia, and each slave owner received $300 per slave. Now that was way below market value. I just need to say that because it's true, way below market value. So the pressure was coming from Congress, was coming from the abolitionist movement, and was coming from the fact that maybe Britain and maybe France might recognize the Confederacy. And Lincoln wanted no part of that. He wanted to contain the war. So there are pressures on Lincoln. And Lincoln had drafted the first draft, if you will, of the Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862. And he was going to issue it as a war measure, as an executive order from the desk of Abraham Lincoln. And it will be his Secretary of State, William Seward, who will urge Lincoln to wait until we have a Union victory. Otherwise, if we do it before we have a Union victory, and the war wasn't going well for the North at all, and Lincoln expected, by the way, to be defeated in the 1864 election, that he would not be reelected, and it will be Seward to wait until we have a Union victory before he issues, by an executive order, the Emancipation Proclamation. And Lincoln agreed to that. I mean, when he assembled his cabinet around the table, he told them, I've already made up my mind. I'm not going to change a word in the Emancipation Proclamation. It's going to happen regardless of what you gentlemen say. And it will be Seward who will give the advice to Lincoln. Wait until there's a conclusive Union victory. Otherwise, and this is Seward, he will tell Lincoln, it'll be seen as our last shriek on the run. That this is the bottom of the barrel. That this is the only option that we have, and that is to free the slaves. And that is the only change that Lincoln will accept. So he took the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation and tucked it into the drawer. So the first victory, and it's not a conclusive victory, the first Union victory was the Battle of Antietam. And it wasn't a conclusive victory. That Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia retreated from Antietam and made their way back into Virginia. So Lincoln waited. And Antietam was not the conclusive victory that he wanted. It was a draw. It's like kissing your sister. It doesn't do much for you. I mean, it was a draw. And he will issue it as an executive order. Now, Lincoln had hoped that at some point that he could transfer this into an amendment. He will in December of 1865, but he'll be dead by then, assassinated in April of 1865. And he felt that if it's an amendment, it'll be more difficult to get it out of the Constitution. And that's why it was an executive order. It's difficult, to get an amendment into the Constitution. And it is as difficult, to get it out of the Constitution. Now, remind me, don't let me forget that point. It's a little fine point, a bit of minutia. Lincoln feared, that if it remained as an executive order, the next president, and again, he expected to be defeated by George B. McClellan, a Democrat, who had lost, if you will, a Union general who had failed to chase Lee back into Virginia, and in effect gave the Army of Northern Virginia, 2.5 years more to engage in combat. So Lincoln was looking for an opportunity to change this from an executive order, which the next president, if Lincoln is not elected, could simply rescind, repeal an executive order. It's that simple. And there was nothing new about executive orders. I mean, Washington was the first one to find language in the Constitution for an executive order, and he issued 8 of them. FDR issued thousands of them to implement New Deal measures. So that's a little bit of the background, the context. And in December of 1865, that the 13th Amendment was added to the Constitution. Now, news of the 13th Amendment, and this is our segue into, hang on, into June 19th. I want to say the 16th, June 19th. That date sticks in my head. And on June 19th, the word of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation finally reached Galveston, Texas. Now, Galveston, Texas, at that time, in 1865, was the largest city in Texas. And so much information flowed through Galveston because of trade, because of the cotton trade. And the word spread. And by the way, the last battle of the Civil War was fought in Texas. And the Confederates won that battle. So, but eventually, of course, with Lincoln's death and with Lee's surrender at Appomattox, that in effect ended the war between the states. And General Gordon, General Gordon was in charge of not the retreat, but the laying down of arms of the Confederacy. In fact, Jefferson Davis, when president of the Confederacy, it was Gordon Granger. Gordon was his first name. General Gordon Granger. When Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, fled Virginia, fled Richmond, he was trying to make his way to Texas to continue the revolution, to continue the existence of the Confederacy. That did not happen. And with the end of the war between the states, and I want to remind all of you that if you're in Mississippi, the state of Jones was carved out of Mississippi. And if you're in Mississippi and you're in Alabama or Louisiana, for your own safety, you had best refer to the war between the Civil War as the war between the states. And not so much today, but in some parts of the South, the Civil War continued, in one's mind, not necessarily on the ground. So General Gordon Granger in June 19th, 1865, finally announced that Lincoln, this is 2.5 years later, that Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and you're all free men, and you're all free women, and your children. And a movie that captured, in the first 5 minutes, the movie that captures this is Miss Jane Pittman, and it's got to be 20 years ago, Cicely Tyson. And if you watch the first 10 or 15 minutes, it'll give you a sense of the end of the war and the slave owner coming out on the balcony and reading the Emancipation Proclamation and telling his slaves, he had about 40 or 50 slaves, that you're free to go or free to stay here, and I'll pay you a decent wage, and I'll treat you as I've always treated you. And some left and some stayed. Part of that story, part of that movie, part of the first 18, 15 minutes deals with the Union soldiers moving through that plantation. And an Ohio veteran is given a bucket full of water by a black slave girl whose name was Tyson. She only had a first name. She didn't need a last name because you weren't a legal person. You just had a first name, like you would name a cow or a horse. You don't need a last name. The mail isn't coming anytime soon, or a brochure to buy this product or any product. So you only needed a first name. So this young girl who speaks, Cicely Tyson, speaks very good English for a young slave girl. But this is the movies. And he asked her what her name was. And she said, my name is Jane. No, Cicely. And he says, no longer. You are now Jane. This is your name as a free girl. Now, just a little sidebar on that. When Martin Luther King Jr., his first daughter, he wanted to name her Jane. And Mrs. King, Coretta King, said, absolutely not. That is a slave name. Absolutely not. And that's where she became Yolanda, which is not a slave name. I'm not quite sure where that name came from. Now, King never called her Yolanda. He called his daughter, not Yo-Yo, and a word around Yolanda. So Jane, and anybody out there whose first name is Jane, that was a slave name. So the general told all these folks, you're now free, and you can come or you can stay, and the owner as well. Now, there's been a movement afoot, not only to change, the wording of the 13th Amendment, to take that clause out of it, because that became a reason to re-enslave people, if you will, worse than slavery, and to work in the mines, to work in the fields, and in California, to volunteer as firefighters to put out those fires in California. And many took that as an opportunity to get out of their cells and to do something, worthwhile. So the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman, as I said, it's worth viewing, particularly the first 10 or 15 minutes. And then from there, it brings her up to Houston. Now, there are many states that have adopted June 19th as a state holiday. I think there are 47, maybe 49. Massachusetts adopted the June 19th as a state holiday, and that was done by Governor Patrick Duval, which makes sense, doesn't it? There's an attempt to get this into the Constitution as the state holiday, into the Constitution as a national holiday. Technically, the end of slavery nationally, with the word finally, 2.5 years later, getting to Texas. That may not happen. We already have a Martin Luther King Day, don't we, as a national holiday. And that causes economic problems and so on and so forth. People are getting the day off, lack of production, an extra day's pay, and all that gets tied up with it. So it is a state holiday. And by the way, I should mention, since it came to me, Massachusetts was the 6th state to ratify the 13th Amendment, the sixth state. And the last state to ratify the 13th Amendment was Mississippi. What a surprise. And Mississippi ratified the 13th Amendment in 1995. Now you're thinking, how did that happen? 1995, they ratified the 13th Amendment? I'll tell you how that happened, because I know you're listening, and I know you're listening hard. When one reads the Constitution, to get an amendment into the Constitution, the framers of the Constitution made it difficult. That 2/3 of the House must ratify, 2/3 of the Senate must ratify, and 3/4 of the states must ratify. Now that's a high percentage to get 3/4 of the state. Mississippi never ratified until 1995. They didn't have to, because without Mississippi, you don't need Mississippi, because 3/4 of the state, one by one, had ratified the 13th Amendment. Now, what brought about the ratification process in Mississippi? Some guy, I guess with too much time on his hands, and was a movie buff, had watched Lincoln Spielberg. And Spielberg, the Lincoln version of Spielberg, the last part of that film, and if you haven't seen it, see it. That's your homework assignment. The last part of that film deals with the background to the ratification of the 13th Amendment. So this chap, whomever he was, wanted to find out the order in which the states had ratified the 13th Amendment, getting to 3/4. And that's where I found out, or he found out, that Massachusetts was the sixth state to ratify the 13th Amendment. Illinois was the first, which makes sense. So he's looking down, and okay, checked off, okay, checked off, checked off, checked off, checked off. There's no Mississippi. No, Mississippi did not ratify the 13th Amendment, because you don't need a Mississippi. You just need the 3/4. So, he brought this up to the people of Mississippi, and he also brought it up on the national news. And Mississippi said, well, we did ratify it, and the paperwork got lost. That's not true. That's not true at all. So in 1995, under pressure, national pressure and state pressure, the legislature of Mississippi formally ratified the 13th Amendment and sent the paperwork up to Washington, D.C. They did so reluctantly, and I'm sure they would like to remain the only state in the Union not to have ratified the 13th Amendment, if you will, to continue the spirit of the war between the states. As I said, it will be Patrick Duval, Governor Duval. I don't know him well enough to call him Patrick. It'll be Governor Duval in 1997 who will pass a decree, and the legislature will approve of it, that Massachusetts will honor June 19th as a state holiday. I don't know whether or not that'll ever become a national holiday, for the reasons that I've said, or whether or not that gets into in the Constitution. It's very difficult to amend it. And I'll come back to this right now. The framers of the Constitution wanted it difficult to amend the Constitution, so that there were not more amendments than language than words, if you will, in the Constitution. A little bit about the history of Texas. This helps to give us context as well. And, maybe you've been to, I'll mention this right now, maybe you've been to Six Flags, as a recreation center. I think it's in New Hampshire, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Six Flags. And I know that for the longest time, why is it called Six Flags? Where did that come from? It's called Six Flags because for a long time, Texas was under the control of 6 separate nations: France, Spain, Britain. I may not get them all. The Confederate flag, the American flag, the Mexican flag. Mexico owned Texas. So when that amusement park or that recreational park was set up in Texas, You see, that's the home headquarters. They were looking for a name. And someone said, how about Six Flags? That we came under the control of 6 different nations until we were the Lone Star Republic. You know, the only separate nation to have been invited into the country. So that's where Six Flags comes from. I know you've always wondered about it.
Nice.
So there you go. And the reason I thought of it, I've been looking at the ads, Six Flags, and I said, why Six Flags? So I went through my notes and notes and notes. Aha, there it is. So it makes perfect sense that the home headquarters of Six Flags is in Texas. Now, the road to the Republic of Texas begins with Mexico. Texas was governed by Mexico. It was seen as part of Mexico. And there had been independence movements in Texas, groups in Texas, to rid themselves of Mexico control. And finally, the government of Mexico, through Stephen Austin, Texas, through Stephen Austin, invited Stephen Austin to recruit settlers, to recruit Americans who would come into Texas, and help to settle Texas. You see, Mexico did not have enough troops, enough administrators, and enough money to be able to control Texas. And they had a real problem with the Apaches and the Comanches, who ran roughshod over any Mexican outposts. So they approached Stephen Austin, a real estate agent, if you will, to recruit 300 good families to come into Texas and help settle it, and to deal with the Comanche problem, the Apaches problem, because they knew that these Americans knew how to take business, knew how to deal with Indians, and he pushed them somewhere else, across the Mississippi River. And for Stephen Austin, his instructions were to recruit good families, whatever that means. You define that, who will help us control Texas. We don't have the money. We don't have the resources. We don't have the militia, the soldiers. But you guys know how to take care of business with the indigenous population. By the way, we do have an indigenous celebration today, don't we? Is it in November? I don't know. I don't know. But I know it's on the books. Now, they wanted land. You see, West Texas became ranchos, cotton, slaveholding. West Texas, do I got that right? No. West Texas, cotton, slavery. East Texas was oil, spindletop oil. Now, these families that were recruited by Stephen Austin had to accept 3 conditions. 1, that you will become a Mexican citizen. You bet. Do I get the land? You bet. All right, you get the land. You have to become an American citizen. Secondly, that you must convert to Catholicism. What's that? Whatever it is, we'll become a Catholic. Do we still get the land? You bet. And the other condition is that you cannot take your slaves into Mexico or to Texas. Do we still get the land? You bet. So I'll become a Mexican citizen. I'll become a Catholic, whatever that is. And I will keep my slaves at home. Now, none of that happened. Do we get the land? Do we get the land? Do we get the land? We were a land-hungry and a land-starved people. Move, move, move. There was no sense of cultivating the land. Wear it out and move along, move along, move along to Texas or to California later on. So none of that happened. There was an independence movement that began to grow. And into this conversation comes Sam Houston, Texas. Houston, we have a problem. Apollo 13. Houston, we have a problem. NASA. Texas it's called Texification. We don't use that word any longer. But Texas has a code of conduct. Lyndon Johnson was from Texas. Lyndon Johnson was all oil, cotton, barbed wire, and so forth. President Polk, James K. Polk, was elected president in 1844. I think it was 1844. I'm not good with dates. I always tell my students that you can always look up the dates. You don't need me. I think I've told some of the viewers this. You don't need me to look up a date. But, and there's a big but coming, you know what it is. The only date you need to know is my birthday. And I'm registered at, and I'll list a number of places. So, one of the issues of 1844 is that Polk said, when elected, not if, when elected, I will look to annex Texas and bring it into the Union as a state. For a number of years, they were the Republic of Texas, the Lone Star Republic, and they appreciate that. You know, we are the Lone Star. We are an independent nation that was annexed in the United States. Now, President Jackson, when he was approached by Sam Houston to annex Texas, he said, I know I can't do it because I'm a slaveholder. You're a slaveholder. It'll look like the slave power conspiracy has invaded the White House, and all we're doing is looking to annex, more land for slavery. And that's when the abolition movement got going, and Britain and France, were refusing to recognize slavery in the United States. This is before the war. And Polk said, if I'm elected, and he was, that I will make provision to annex Texas. Now, dig out a map. I don't have one with me. But the dispute and the war, Mr. Polk's war, and the dispute with Mexico over the situation in Texas was focused on what is the southern boundary of Texas. Now, the Mexican maps, get a map out. Time is up. Get a map out. That Mexico claimed that the southern boundary of Texas, and you can find this, Rose, you can find the yellow rose of Texas. There's a long story behind that as well. And it dealt with blacks of color, light skin, the rose of Texas. That's a long story that I don't want to get into, but you probably know part of it. So on the maps that the Mexico government had, their southern boundary of Texas was the Oasis River. And the Oasis River is a trickle. And we'll use my hand up here. Here is the Oasis River. The Mexicans and President Polk said, I agree with you. The southern boundary of Texas is the Rio Grande down here. It's not the Oasis. It's the Rio Grande. And that's a roaring river, and that's a real good endpoint for the Texas border. You can hear it, you can see it, you can fish it, you can boat in it. Not this trickle, the Oasis. So what Polk will do to settle the issue, that's why it's called Mr. Polk's War, what Polk will do to settle the issue is send troops in between the Oasis and the Rio Grande. This is our border of Texas, the Republic of Texas, the Lone Star Republic, not this border. So he sends troops in there. And for Mexico, they see this as an invasion. And a war commences. The Mexican War. A war commences. And Polk sends troops in between the Oasis and the Rio Grande. For the Mexican government, they see this as an invasion of their territory. And that begins the war with Mexico. Mexico is defeated, and we have the Republic of Texas. Now, for the abolitionists in the North, and for many others as well, that this looked like a slave power conspiracy to bring more slavery into the United States and move it toward California. So therefore, Texas becomes an independent republic, and we have the Houston Astros, don't we? And we have at football, there's going to be another football franchise. Remember the Houston Oilers had failed, and Texas became America's team, the Dallas Cowboys. And Do you remember that? They were America's team, with their attractive cheerleaders, and all of that. And Houston, we have a problem. NASA, we have a problem. So Texification is very much still with us. So in 1845, Texas is annexed as the Lone Star Republic, and the sweep into Texas begins. And finally, the news of the Emancipation Proclamation gets to Texas through Galveston, which was the largest city in Texas at that time. All the trade went through it, all the commerce went through it, and all the word of what was going on within the country went through it. And that word of the Emancipation Proclamation, as I said earlier, got to Texas in June 19th. And the people were told that you are henceforth and forever free. Some left, some stayed. And Miss Jane Pittman is about those groups who remained. And she's Jane Pittman. And you can find out why she took the name Pittman. And that's a story in and of itself. So, Texas has always celebrated June 19th, as their Independence Day. And as I said today, 47 states have accepted June 19th as really Independence Day for Black Americans across the country, not Lincoln's proclamation, Emancipation Proclamation. And you can do with that struggle as you like. But in Texas, it's a state holiday. People get the day off, and they dress up in red, black, and blue, which were the colors of many of the African states. And it's a day of celebration, of parties, of cookouts, and so on and so forth. And it slowly has made its way, northward. And if you look at the Constitution of the state of Texas, after they were accepted, before they were accepted, it's very clear about slavery. Slavery is the law in Texas, that no free blacks can move into Texas, because that'll set an example. And so all of that gets turned upside down on June 19th. Lincoln, I'll come back to that later on. It's a day of celebration. We don't celebrate it up here. And I know very few of you know about it in Massachusetts. Now, I know we're going, beyond the borders of Massachusetts. This is
national.
Pardon me?
We're national.
Yeah, we're national. And I don't get any mail, do I?
Not yet.
And I've been doing this for a while. I don't get any mail. I don't get any contributions. Gary, keep it up. Do more and do more.
Oh, yeah.
So, in Texas, it's a national holiday, and has been so for years and years and years. And another movie that you should watch, because it celebrates Texification, and this is an old movie, and some of you are too young to remember it, and that is The Alamo, the Battle of the Alamo, where Travis, who had a reputation. This doesn't get into that movie that he left his wife, that he left his children. He was wanted on warrants. I think it was in Texas, wherever it was. And he got into Texas where nobody chased you. And he found himself caught up with the Alamo because Mexican troops had moved under Santa Ana, had moved into Mexico when the Mexicans began talking, not the Mexicans, the Texans began talking about independence. And the Battle of the Alamo, and this is the Texification of the country, began with the movie The Battle of the Alamo. And all of the Alamo defenders were killed, weren't they? They were overwhelmed by the Mexicans of Santa Ana. And it's a moving part, it's a very moving part of that movie where Travis, they're surrounded by the Mexican army, or surrounded that way by the Mexican. I'm going to go to my left and my right. That's why I played second base, or shortstop, depending where we needed to plug me in. Now there's a segue. So Travis takes out his sword and draws a line in the dust inside the Alamo. They said, "Who wants to stay with me?" cross this line. And those who don't, do not cross the line, and nothing will be said about it, and you will be allowed to surrender to the Mexicans. Every man, and this is such a moving part of the Texification of Texas history. And by the way, the history of Texas is taught both in the 4th grade and in the 7th grade. I don't know if there's the history of Massachusetts taught in Massachusetts at all. It gets filled in with Plymouth and the Puritans and Plymouth Rock and so forth. It's part of our heritage. You know, it's part of becoming Massachusetts, which is an Indian name. It means great hills, big hills, and from the Blue Hills. And so Travis draws the line. It's a moving scene in the movie, and every man crosses it, and they know they're going to die. So Jim Bowie is there, Davy Crockett is there, and they're all killed by Mexican troops. And what offended many Americans is that they were not given a Christian burial. They were stacked up. This is not part of the history of Texas. We don't learn about it in Massachusetts. All the dead were stacked up like cordwood rather than giving a decent Christian burial. They were stacked up like cordwood and then burned. A funeral pyre, if you will. And that really gets mentioned in the history books around here. It's not part of our Texification. So they're not given a Christian burial. They're all burned. But that isn't included in the movie The Alamo. So you've got 2 movies to watch. You know, The Alamo and Miss Jane Pittman. I need to tell you a story, a personal story about the Alamo. And by the way, you can visit the Alamo, and it's surrounded by skyscrapers. I mean, it's a little, not village, I mean, it's a little fort in downtown Texas. I mean, it's all surrounded by skyscrapers. Here's my story. A couple of years ago, I wanted to shift some money from one account to another account. And the headquarters was in Texas. And this young girl, I phoned down there to make the shift in some monies. All very legitimate, by the way. I wasn't trying to duck taxes. And the person I was dealing with, a young girl from Texas, and she had that accent. And if people are proud of being from Texas, and they put that accent on if they really want to cement it, or they make sure they wear that Stetson cap or those cowboy boots. They want you to know they're from Texas, the only nation to become a state in the great United States of America. So, and she had that Texas accent. And so we were chatting a little bit, and she asked me, do you live anywhere in the Boston area? And I said, yes. And she said, do you live anywhere near Plymouth? Plymouth. And that Bridgewater was the first inland, I almost said state, the first inland area when they came off of Plymouth. And I said, Plymouth? I said, it's Plymouth. It's Plymouth? I said, it's Plymouth. I see, this was right around Thanksgiving, and I couldn't understand how she would ever call it Plymouth. So we finished up our paperwork, and I said to myself, and I was really good on this one, I'm not usually this fast. And I said, I plan next year to visit the Alamo. And she said, the Alamo? It's the Alamo. And she said, I get it. And we had a great laugh, and she had a history lesson, and she said, this guy is playing with me when I said the Alamo. So, but she got it, and we both had a good laugh, and bang, I had a cell phone. Bang, the phone went down. Lyndon Johnson, when he ran for the vice presidency, and later on at 64 for the presidency, liked to celebrate, his Texas heritage. He needed the electoral votes of Texas, and he would do it this way. Boy, he was a gamer, wasn't he? He would be among the top 10 presidents, Johnson, except for the Vietnam War. But here's what he would do. When he came into there would be a large group at a carnival or a fair or something that had come to hear Lyndon Johnson campaign for the Kennedy ticket or for his own ticket in '64, and he would wear his Stetson. That's the sign, isn't it? The Stetson cap. And his gimmick was that when the helicopter moved in around the crowd, Lyndon would wave to everybody. Oh, Lyndon, when's the first time Lyndon Johnson has ever lied to you? When's the last time? Never. And I will never lie to you as your president. And what he would do is, the crowd, of course, would be waving and cheering, and he would lean out of the helicopter. I want somebody to make sure you hold my belt. He would lean out and take off his Stetson, and then like a piece of pizza, he would scale it, just across the crowd. And he always had a young boy in the crowd. Find out where that hat landed. That hat cost me, that Stetson cost me $100. I want that back. And so there would be a kid out there, and he would get the hat back with Lyndon Johnson's autograph on it. I mean, that's Lyndon Johnson. And Lyndon Johnson was oil, barbed wire, cattle, and all of that, rolled into one. The Houston Astros, the Dallas Cowboys, the Houston Oilers, and we celebrate it today, don't we? Now, I've never been to Texas, and I don't plan to. It takes, apparently, from my brother, he said it takes 3 days to drive across Texas. Now, that's with stopping, and getting fuel and so forth. 3 days to drive across Texas. So, see, this is going to be a good thing to have a crowd. And I could get Texas stories, from these folks that have been there. So, unless you have a question, Rose, right? I'm pretty much, we're pretty much wrapping up here. So, June 19th, it is a state holiday. It's not celebrated here. I know you don't hear about it. But it will become maybe a federal holiday. I doubt it. We have Martin Luther King, and it is, our first daughter is not going to be Jane at all. It's a slave name, and she was right about that. And so I'm going to wrap it up here, and I can't hear your questions coming across YouTube, but I never knew until an hour ago that we go national on this.
Oh, yeah.
So people can tune in anytime they want to.
Yeah, yeah.
Amazing. Amazing. And worse than slavery, the chain gangs, roads, bridges, putting out fires, but they didn't wear Jim Crow laws. They didn't wear the outfit that these guys are wearing. Mr. Lincoln's T-mails, this is an assignment. Lincoln was a technocrat, and he liked technology. This is, and look how short it is. Anything by Eric Foner is a keeper. You don't need to read this. I mean, you won't live long enough to finish it. But at least I won't. Well, I finished it once. I'm never going back to it again. Too much. But anything by Eric Foner is well done. The State of Jones, Secession Within Secessionist Mississippi. Is there another one here?
No.
Was that it?
That's it.
I could have brought a dozen, but we didn't have time to talk about a dozen. No student will ever read this, ever. You can take my word for it. They will read this. This is a fun book. This is a Lincoln that I know not you folks, but you students would never have met. And you can read it at a red light. So, over and out. Thank you for your company.